Sign the waiver, hand over your keys, and let us get back to real business. You have nothing left here.
My father transferred every single property deed directly into a master land trust. I own the ground under you.
The operating company doesn't own any real estate. The rent debt is millions of dollars, and it's due today.
You took the wrapper, but I kept the chocolate. You have 2 hours to clear out your personal belongings.
The paper in her hand was shaking so violently you could hear it rustling against the oak conference table. The smirk that had been plastered across my stepmother's face for the past 6 months didn't just fade, it vanished, leaving behind a blank, hollow mask of absolute confusion. Her high-priced corporate attorney, a man who had spent the last 2 hours treating me like a fly on his polished shoes, looked as if every drop of blood had been drained straight out of his body. He stared at the page, looked up at me, and then back down, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Nobody in that room knew the truth. Not my stepmother, not her legal team, and certainly not the board of directors who had spent the last week whispering behind my back about how weak I was. They thought they were watching a coward sign away his birthright. They thought they were watching a defeated son surrender everything his late father had spent 40 years building. But that's not where this story began. 3 months earlier, my father's heart gave out. He was a self-made titan, the founder and sole owner of a commercial real estate empire worth north of $80 million. Growing up, I didn't sit in an executive chair. My father believed in earned respect, not inherited privilege. He made me start at the bottom. I wore steel-toed boots, drove a battered pickup, poured concrete, repaired HVAC units, and negotiated tenant disputes on job sites in the pouring rain. By 35, I knew every single brick, every ledger, and every employee in that company better than I knew myself. Then came the funeral. My father had remarried 5 years prior. His new wife was 20 years his junior, obsessed with status, and thoroughly convinced that running a multi-billion-dollar portfolio required nothing more than an expensive wardrobe and an icy demeanor. At the repast, while the ink on my father's death certificate was barely dry, she pulled me into my father's private study. She didn't offer condolences. She offered an ultimatum. She informed me that my father's latest will left the estate, the primary mansion, and controlling interest in the company entirely to her. She told me my services as vice president were no longer required, and that if I stepped foot on any of the corporate properties, she would have security escort me off in handcuffs. "You were always just a glorified handyman to him," she sneered, sipping her wine while I stood there in my morning suit. "He gave you a job out of pity, but the adults are taking over now." I didn't yell, I didn't smash a glass, I didn't even raise my voice. I simply looked at her, nodded, and said, "I understand." My personal attorney nearly threw a chair through a window when I told him the news. He begged me to contest the will. He insisted we had grounds for undue influence, fraud, and mental incapacity. "We can fight this in court for the next 5 years, he yelled at me. "You're letting her rob you blind. People are going to think you're insane." I looked him in the eye and told him to stand down. I told him we wouldn't contest a single clause. In fact, I instructed him to draft a complete non-negotiable waiver of claims, fully surrendering all rights to my father's estate and the corporate entity. Everyone thought I had lost my mind. The senior board members called me weak. My friends thought I was in shock from grief. My stepmother bragged openly at her country club that I was a spineless boy who folded the second real power showed up. They had no idea what was coming. You see, my stepmother was so blinded by greed and her own vanity that she overlooked one massive, fundamental reality. She saw a shiny company with 50 commercial buildings, millions in monthly rent, and a pristine reputation. What she didn't know, what nobody outside of my father and his absolute most trusted inner circle knew, was how my father actually structured his empire 3 years ago. Remember that detail, it matters later. Over the next 2 months, the escalation was relentless. My stepmother took over the corner office. She immediately fired my father's loyal staff, bought a $300,000 luxury company car, and announced to the press that under her visionary leadership, the company would be expanding into aggressive high-risk developments. She threw lavish parties on the company dime and openly mocked my father's memory, calling his conservative business style outdated. Every time I bumped into her in public at a restaurant or a charitable event, she made a point to embarrass me. "Look, everyone," she'd laugh loudly to her wealthy socialite friends, "it's the boy who walked away from millions, still driving that old truck." I just smiled, wished her well, and walked away. I kept my head down and stayed perfectly calm. The angrier the community got on my behalf, the quieter I became. I let her parade around. I let her sign new vendor contracts. I let her execute massive corporate loans, leveraging the company's assets to fuel her extravagant lifestyle. She thought she was climbing to the top of the world. In reality, she was tying her own noose, not by meticulous knot. This brings us to the point of no return. Last Thursday, she summoned me to the main corporate headquarters for the formal execution of the estate transfer. She wanted a public circus. She invited the entire board of directors, the senior legal team, and local business press. She wanted to record the moment I officially signed away my right to contest the estate, cementing her absolute victory in front of everyone who mattered. The conference room was packed. My stepmother sat at the head of the table in a custom Italian suit flanked by her lead counsel. I walked in wearing jeans and a simple leather jacket holding a single black pen. "Ah, the prodigal son arrives to surrender," she announced, earning a few polite chuckles from her hired guns. "Sign the waiver, hand over your master keys, and let us get back to real business." Her lawyer pushed the heavy stack of legal documents across the table. I sat down, pulled the pages toward me, and quietly signed my name on every designated line. I didn't hesitate. I didn't argue. My stepmother grinned, leaning back in her chair with a look of supreme triumph. That was easier than I thought. I suppose some people just aren't built for power. I capped my pen, slid the signed documents back across the table, and leaned back. "I signed everything," I said softly. "The estate is yours. The company entity, the corporate name, the branding, and every bank account attached to that specific LLC belong entirely to you. And don't you forget it," she smirked. "There's just one tiny detail my father and I neglected to put in the public press releases 3 years ago," I said, my tone as even as calm water. Her lawyer frowned, adjusting his glasses. "What are you talking about?" "The estate owns $80 million in commercial real estate." "No," I replied, looking directly into the lawyer's eyes. "The estate owns the operating company, but 3 years ago when my father realized his health was declining, he restructured the assets. He created a master land trust. He transferred the actual physical land, the buildings, and every single property deed out of the corporate entity and directly into that trust." The room went dead silent. The lawyer stopped smiling. "And who is the sole trustee and 100% beneficiary of that master land trust?" the lawyer asked, his voice suddenly trembling. "I am," I said. I pulled a thick blue folder out of my jacket and tossed it onto the table. "The company you now own doesn't own a single square inch of real estate," I explained, watching the color slowly drain from my stepmother's face. "It is merely a management tenant. And as the sole owner of the land and buildings, I issued a formal ground lease rent increase 30 days ago, as permitted by the Master Trust Charter. Effective at midnight last night, the rent for every single building your company occupies increased by 400%. My stepmother gasped, turning to her attorney. "Is this true? What is he talking about?" Her lawyer's hands were shaking as he rapidly flipped through the deeds in my blue folder. His face went completely white. He dropped his pen. "Oh my God," he whispered, looking up at her with pure terror. He owns the ground under every building. The operating company is completely insolvent. The rent debt alone is millions of dollars due today." "That's not all," I continued, standing up slowly. "Because you used the corporate entity as collateral for your personal luxury loans and new developments without checking the asset titles, you've committed massive bank fraud. The lenders will be freezing all corporate accounts by 5 o'clock today. Furthermore, as the landlord, I am formally evicting your corporate entity for non-payment of the new lease terms. You have 2 hours to clear your personal belongings out of my building." The room erupted into absolute chaos. Board members began shouting at her. The legal team scrambled to gather their files. My stepmother stood up, her face twisted in rage and shock, screaming that she would sue me, that I was a monster, that I couldn't do this. "You took the wrapper," I told her quietly, looking down at her as she trembled. "I kept the chocolate. Have a nice life." I walked out of that conference room into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the shouting and panic behind me. Over the next month, the dominoes fell with terrifying speed. The bank called in her loans immediately. Facing federal fraud charges and mountain-high lease defaults, the corporate entity collapsed into complete bankruptcy. She was forced to sell the mansion, her luxury cars, and her personal jewelry just to pay off her mounting legal fees. Last I heard, she's living in a rented one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, drowning in civil lawsuits from angry investors. As for me, I rebranded the properties, hired back every single one of my father's loyal employees with a 20% raise, and kept building. I didn't need to throw a party. I didn't need to brag. The work spoke for itself just like my father taught me. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments.